Just hearing the words home invasion is gut-wrenching for people living here, many telling us they were immediately on edge when they learned something happened and immediately taken back.
Now, during the arraignment, Savoy did refer to the murder suspect, saying, quote, "What they did was horrible and they deserve to pay for it."
This was a case that was definitely hard on everyone involved, not just the people in our office, but the state police who worked on it, the other investigators who worked on it. For everyone, it was an extremely difficult case for a lot of reasons.
Gribble stated that if he realized she was alive, he would have killed her.
Don't expect to commit a crime and get away with it, because you're gonna pay for it. It was indeed a shattered neighborhood as 4 teens kills mother all for fun. However, this brutal murder of Kimberly Cates was a sensational murder that garnered widespread media coverage in the U.S. because of the severity of the crime.
Jen, the last 2 hours of testimony were like something out of a horror movie, except they were real. An admitted killer, in his own words, who seemed to relish recalling the details of hacking and slashing and cutting a mother and her child in front of an audience.
What happened to Kimberly Cates, and what was the relationship between Kimberly and the teens? Join us as we delve deeper into the case of the horrible killing that shook the world. Before we go deep into this thrill killing, let's see how it all started. This is Mount Vernon, a charming small hamlet in the New Hampshire countryside, named for George Washington's birthplace. Less than 3,000 people live in Mount Vernon, an affluent, tight-knit neighborhood with low crime and high levels of trust, where residents feel safe leaving their doors unlocked at night. Relocating from Baltimore 5 years prior, 42-year-old Kimberly Cates, her husband David, and their 11-year-old daughter Jamie were living a comfortable life as of 2009 in verdant Mount Vernon. The Cates were eager to live in a small town, and Mount Vernon's charming rural setting made it the perfect place for them to live. Kimberly was a loving and enthusiastic person who was dedicated to her career as a pediatric nurse. Meanwhile, she had adapted to small-town life rather well. The Cates moved into a big ranch-style property 2 miles outside of town. The house was one of only 4 on a dirt road in a remote location bordered by woodland, and 4 trowel roads stood half a mile down. The family enjoyed their new home's peace and quiet, but David had to drive hours a day to work as an engineer for the DAE systems, 26 times a year, and the remote location of the house had caused Kimberly to feel a little uneasy. The family did, however, add motion sensors and an alarm system. Kimberly and her neighbor came to an agreement that they would watch over one another's houses. But by 2009, security worries had mostly subsided, and nothing negative had ever occurred in Mount Vernon. There hadn't been a homicide in the community for more than 20 years, but all that is about to change because this community received the shock of their lives as the day took a dark turn. David left for his business trip in Maryland on Saturday, October 3rd, 2009, leaving Kimberly and Jamie alone in the house. The mother and daughter were used to spending Saturdays together, and they frequently shared the master bedroom when David was not around. David sent his wife a note later that evening, wishing them a restful night. Kimberly replied, stating that they were supposed to visit the karate studio and the mall the following day so Jamie could practice her newfound passion, but those plans were never carried out. That morning at 4:15 a.m., Milford County Dispatch sent out a request for mutual aid to Sergeant Kevin Furlong in relation to a possible home invasion. The caller was whimpering silently, so the dispatcher could not get any clear details from her. The call came from 4 Trowel Road. Furlong called for backup while he approached the house and peered through the front windows, thinking he was responding to a break-in or home invasion. He saw movement in the kitchen. It seems that a young girl with a bloody head had raised it from behind a kitchen counter. According to Sergeant Furlong, Jamie was shivering and murmured to him that she believed her mother had passed away.
She then said in a whisper while shaking that she thought her mommy was dead.
She was attempting to scream, but nothing was coming out of her mouth. She claimed that 2 people, one with a knife and the other with a bat, broke into their home and beat her mother. David Cates awoke in his hotel room in Maryland to the horrifying news that his daughter, who was gravely injured, was in the hospital and that his wife had been murdered at their home. However, Jamie, who was 11 years old, had been horribly injured. She had sustained 18 cuts and slashes to her head, arms, and chest. Jamie had been hit so hard that she had a fractured jaw, a shattered skull, a punctured lung, part of her foot missing, and her big toe nearly severed. Yet she had survived and was coherent enough to tell the police all the horrific details of what had happened the night before. Jamie reported that she saw her mother sitting up in bed in the dark when she had woken up in the wee hours of the morning. "Is that you, Jamie?" her mother said over and again. A man began hitting her mother with what appeared to be a baseball bat before she started screaming, and another man attacked Jamie with a knife. Despite her mother's valiant efforts to plead with the guy and protect Jamie with her body, the blows continued. Jamie had once leaped off the bed, only to crash into a glass door after being hurled there. She was lying on the ground, pretending to be dead. The men said to her, "Get the jewelry." She staggered into the kitchen and dialed 911 after she was certain they had finally left the house. Kimberly Cates was struck 36 times in the head and torso with what appeared to be a machete, according to the results of an autopsy. She had been alive for the most of the ordeal, but the blows had been so severe that they had cracked her skull and penetrated her brain. Who could have carried out such a pointless and horrifying attack? Although Jamie's story implied that it might have been a burglary gone awry, the crime's characteristics did not match those of a robbery. This was not a robbery. Kimberly and her daughter had been attacked when they were asleep in their beds, and the only jewelry that had been taken from the house was a small amount. The cops had multiple leads as soon as the inquiry started. 22-year-old Jamie Hollins was visiting a friend's home in the neighboring town of Brookline when he heard two pals discussing how they had just slain a mother and a kid in a Mount Vernon home, all the while having two other friends observe. Moreover, a number of other adolescents came forward with identical allegations, detailing how the two had been showing off knives and saying that this was only the beginning of their homicidal rampage. Those teenagers were 17-year-old Stephen Spader and 19-year-old Christopher Gribble, while the two friends who had watched the attack were 18-year-old Williams Marks and 17-year-old Quinn Glover. Stephen Spader's family residence at 7 Wallace Brook Road in Brookline was approached by state troopers John Encarnacion and Jeff Ardini in the afternoon of Monday, October 5th. They encountered Christopher Gribble and Stephen Spader outside the house as they were leaving. They were brought to the state police barracks after both consented to an interview. Glover and Marks, however, had already arrived at the station and none of them was going home. Encarnacion and Trooper Jeff Ardini questioned Christopher Gribble for about 7 hours. At the time of his detainment, Gribble was wearing camouflage gear and carrying 4 pocket knives. But what was a teenager doing with pocket knives? Upon arriving at the station, Gribble was cheerful and helpful, regaling the cops with long-winded tales about his strategic genius with Dungeons and Dragons. He declared, "I have discovered a remarkable aptitude for both tactical and strategic thinking." Still, Gribble had seen the incident in Mount Vernon that day on the TV and found the whole thing extremely unsettling. It so happened that on the night of the murder, he and Spader had been in the vicinity. Up until the wee hours of Sunday morning, they had been traveling aimlessly down some back roads, only halting once at a small dirt pull-off equipped with a tractor so they could use the lavatory. But when Gribble's car was searched, what was found was a knife, rope, hatchet, garbage bags, shovel, and a receipt from a pawn shop for $200 worth of jewelry made out to Gribble. Gribble was unfazed by the receipt when he was shown. He explained that on Saturday, he and his buddies had gone to a yard sale where they had bought $20 worth of jewelry to sell at a cash for gold kiosk. Now turning up the heat, Encarnacion informed Gribble that his friends were in separate rooms, giving quite different accounts of the group's activities during the weekend. Conversely, Gribble claimed that Encarnacion was trying to control him, but as the incriminating evidence grew, including information that only the 4 guilty parties could have known, he modified his strategy, started speaking, and he didn't stop once he got going. Christopher Gribble, who was homeschooled and had never received a parking ticket, was a devoted Mormon and prospective church missionary. Thus, he didn't exactly fit the description of a killer. He informed people that becoming an Eagle Scout was one of his life's greatest achievements. Richard, his father, and his wife Tamara had attempted to inculcate a set of values in their son during his early years by teaching him right from wrong. But Christopher faced certain difficulties of his own as he grew older. He was uncomfortable with other people, laughed inappropriately, struggled to read social indications, such as boredom, and was not excellent with peers. He didn't seem to talk much, but when he did, he would speak endlessly. Later on, his father noted that although Christopher was articulate and smart, he struggled to tell when someone wanted to stop talking to him. And, his father added, he thought that, whatever his perspective, it was the correct one. Christopher thus found it difficult to make friends, experienced loneliness as a child, and saw himself as a social outsider. He held his mother responsible for this, as she had decided to homeschool him. Christopher later said that he had been abused by his mother. However, his claims of the assault were not always reliable. He claimed that his mother would use tweezers to remove alleged diseased hairs from his head and pop acne on his back, all the while pinning him down and commanding him to be quiet. He had been made to carry a vacuum around the house since he was a small child. He had been spanked several times, and his parents had not always accepted his story of what had happened outside the house. Later on, Tamara Gribble acknowledged that she had once spanked Christopher so severely as a child that it had shattered a spoon. Despite her lack of control, Tamara Gribble was saddened, and she kept the broken spoon in her bureau as a memento of her sorrow. She refuted Christopher's allegations of mistreatment. However, fantasies about killing his mother had started to creep into Christopher's early adolescence. Like his writings, the fantasies were vivid, detailed, and a little weird, like chopping her up piece by piece. Other fantasies involved dousing her in boiling water, causing her limbs to ache, and dusting her with sugar to attract birds that would pick at her. At a cadet camp, he eventually told a counselor about his deadly fantasies. Gribble's parents brought him in for a psychological assessment. However, Gribble acknowledged having worries that he would turn into a serial rapist during their meetings. Gribble's psychiatrist concluded that he was exhibiting antisocial personality disorder symptoms as a result, but noted that he was still too young for a formal diagnosis. On the other hand, two ladies claimed that Gribble had touched them inappropriately, but Gribble insisted that he had just crossed paths with them. When his parents rejected his account of what happened, he became furious. In 2009, 19-year-old Christopher Gribble was working as a handyman for his local Mormon church and planning to become a church missionary when he reconnected with the boy he had met in Cub Scouts years earlier. Despite looks, he and 17-year-old Stephen Spader found they still had a lot in common, such as Gribble's car. However, Spader didn't have a car of his own and started asking Gribble for rides to and from college and throughout the city. Later, Spader's friends said that Gribble fulfilled all of Spader's requests. Spader presented Gribble to his pals, a bunch of disgruntled local youth, many of whom were misfits or criminals. When Gribble arrived at the gathering, Spader's girlfriend did not exactly greet him with open arms, labeling him Creepy Chris. For Gribble, however, it was a life-changing event, his first taste of true friendship. He even got a girlfriend soon after. Like Gribble, Spader had faced his fair share of difficulties as he matured. He was born into a drug-addled household. At birth, his mother had tested positive for cocaine and marijuana. However, the Spaders were committed to giving him a safe and loving home since he had been adopted by a loving family at the age of 5 days. While Stephen was younger, he was outgoing and friendly, playing with neighborhood kids and participating in school productions. However, his mother, Christine Spader, saw a shift in her son while he was in middle school. She mentioned a lovely youngster who was actually our son, but he changed overnight into an unmanageable person with serious problems. Mood swings and violent outbursts were those problems. He had threatened his father with a knife after a heated argument with his parents. Another time, he snatched up kitchen knives and started tossing food and slashing the counters. Additionally, Spader frequently experienced anxiety and used prescription and recreational substances as self-medication. He got a reputation for being violent at school after shaving his head, making people afraid to meddle with him. Spader's parents reportedly sent him to see physicians and counselors, and a psychiatrist identified borderline and antisocial personality disorder characteristics in him, according to a former pupil at his school. In an attempt to provide him a new beginning, Spader's parents refinanced their house to cover the cost of his attendance at a prestigious and more nurturing private school, from which he eventually dropped out. By the middle of 2009, Spader had been charged with narcotics possession and had started telling his buddies straight out about his increasing obsession with murder, torture, and robbery. It seemed that he had adopted the image of a violent, scary mobster, and he had a strong control over the companions he chose to surround himself with. Spader told his pals in the latter part of summer 2009 that he was creating a criminal syndicate or brotherhood of which he would serve as president. The group would use the moniker Disciples of Destruction, and Spader proposed Gribble, William Marks, who was 18, and Quinn Glover, who was 17, as his first recruits. Making money was the club's main goal. However, Spader drafted a mission statement that included a thorough set of objectives and bylaws. Violence was just as important as loyalty and brotherhood. In order to join, his new recruits would have to invade a house. If anyone was home at the time, they would have to kill them, he said. All three of the new recruits nodded. Subsequently, Marks and Glover assert that their intention was solely to commit property theft, not murder. But Gribble was full of enthusiasm. He was furious and dejected after breaking up with Ashley Martin, his new girlfriend. All four of them had admitted their parts in the horrifying attack on Jamie and Kimberly Cates by the evening of October 5th. Gribble was the one who said the most. He seemed almost eager about the chance to relate the dramatic circumstances of that night now that he'd come clean. What's more, he had something to say that, for once, people wanted to hear. Not just anybody, but the police. Important people. Gribble informed the police that Williams, Marks, and Spader had driven around seeking for the ideal house to break into a few days prior to the murder. In a remote area of the densely forested dirt road, they discovered the ideal home, a sizable ranch-style property with a tractor parked in the driveway. "We are going to do the most evil thing this town has ever seen," declared Spader. Quinn allegedly stood behind the door, covering his ears to block off the screams, while Marks claimed to have watched the murder take place from the doorway. Nevertheless, Quinn and Marks did not try to stop Spader and Gribble or ask for assistance. The four teenagers looked around the house, including the master bedroom, seeking valuables while the mother and daughter lay dying inside. The murderers then took a car to Autumn Savoy's 20-year-old residence. Savoy came up with the plan to throw the evidence into the Nashua River after having already consented to give them an alibi. But instead of feeling horrible after the killing, Gribble claimed to have felt a tremendous weight taken off his shoulder. Later that day, all four murderers were taken into custody. Following their attack on Jamie, age 11, Spader and Gribble were charged with first-degree murder and attempted murder. Marks and Glover faced charges of armed robbery, burglary, and conspiracy to commit burglary. Spader was the first to be tried as a minor, and the public was not allowed access to any court records pertaining to his arrest or life. Spader received a life sentence without the chance of release. Later, after the U.S. Supreme Court outlawed life in prison for juvenile offenders, Spader turned down the chance to request a sentence reduction, calling himself the most sick and twisted person you'll ever meet. Marks and Glover had agreed to plea bargains in exchange for testifying against Gribble and Spader. Glover received a sentence of 20 to 40 years, while Marks received a term of 30 to 60 years. As the final witness to the jury, Gribble would enter a not guilty by reason of insanity plea. Even though Gribble contradicted himself multiple times during his 3-day testimony, he remained composed and even cheerful as he sparred with the prosecutors. Jurors dismissed Gribble's claim of insanity in the meanwhile. State psychiatrist Dr. Albert Druktina stated that Gribble was cunning, manipulative, and a liar rather than suffering from delusions or an incapacity to regulate his behavior. He received a life sentence without the chance of release. Neuropsychologist Kent Keel, who assessed Gribble following the murder, said that his icy demeanor throughout the interview was a persona he had taken on. In actuality, he claimed to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, someone with a brittle sense of self who chose to be a psychopath. He claimed that Spader's unstable criminality had definitely impacted Gribble, who was suggestible and young and looked up to him. Regardless of the dynamics, what they did that evening traumatized the community and shattered a family. According to a longtime Mount Vernon resident, the killings had torn at the heart and soul of the quaint, small New England community. David Cates also talked on the terrible loss of the woman who had been Jamie's best friend and his soulmate. Although Jamie didn't have her mother growing up, she does have one positive aspect to this tale. Celebrating the memory of Kimberly Cates, a woman whose happiness and energy carry on in her daughter, the 9th annual Kimberly Cates Memorial Golf Tournament takes place 10 years to the day of the close-knit community at Amherst Country Club. Though it's been 15 years already, the pain is still fresh around the community of Mount Vernon. What do you think about this shocking story? Do you think the punishment for the teens was a fair one? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to click on any of our videos displaying on your screen now for more shocking and solved cases like this. See you in our next video.